Welcome back to HSH 1000, The Human Condition. I'm Dr. Cafe Lu, and in the previous video, I showed you around pre-imperial China where we did a quick lab to get the initial feel for the changing political climate in Xunzi's time. In this video, I'm going to do something similar with 100 schools of thought. Our quick lab will focus on the thinkers and the ideas that are circulating around Xunzi. He's going to get into some arguments with people, so if you want to be in on what's going on, you're going to need to know some of the backstory behind their war of words. In the beginning of TV shows or movies, when a newcomer arrives, there's often a scene where someone gives them a rundown of who's who. Think Sergeant Jeffords for Captain Holt at the 9-9, Enid's tour of Nevermore with Wednesday Addams, or the hand-drawn map that Janice made for Katie of North Shore High. That's what I'll do in this video. I'm going to give you a little bit of the gossip happening with the 100 schools during the Warring States so that when you flip through the text, you'll be in on who Xunzi is beefing with and why. Now, we can't cover everybody mentioned in the text, but we'll hit 3 of the central figures that come from 2 of the major cliques or schools of thought. And I'll work through them roughly in chronological order so you can get a sense of how the collective discourse builds. I'll start with Xunzi, move to Mozi, and then to Mengzi, linking where I can to previous topics in earlier videos. Finally, I end by considering the role of naming and social conventions of language. This gives us a chance to think about the role of words in the broader context of our lives. By the end of this video, you should be able to state at least one central view of Xunzi, Mozi, and Mengzi, articulate general points of disagreement between the Confucians and the Mohists, and explain the extent to which words and their use are both prescriptive and not prescriptive. So let's go spill some tea.
Everyone living in this period generally agrees the Sage Kings did it better. After all, they didn't live in war and chaos, so they serve as models for how we should live. And all we need to do is revert back to whatever they were doing and undo our deviations. But people disagree which deviations are the critical ones in need of correction. Xunzi provides a few examples. Xunzi, later called Confucius by Jesuit missionaries in the 16th century, is the person you're most likely to have heard of before HSH. The Zi in Xunzi, Mozi, Mengzi, Xunzi is actually an honorific. Xunzi means master, teacher, Kong. And Xunzi lived at the end of the Spring and Autumn period, the bad half of the Zhou dynasty, when 100 states would fight 600 battles and civil wars to become only 40. Living at the end of this period of decline, Xunzi is hoping to still return to the ways of the past before it's too late. Particularly, he saw Western Zhou practices of rituals as better. The people of the Spring and Autumn period needed to correct themselves and return to the old ways because for him, deviant ritual practices were the defining problem of his time. In the Analects, Xunzi is horrified that the Ji family used 8 rows of dancers. Wait, what? Let me explain. Remember the concept of ritual or li, which maintains social and familial roles in relationships, especially the hierarchical ones, by having its participants observe practices based on their different positions? Yeah, that one. A significant part of the ritual practices were the sumptuary regulation. Basically, what you are allowed to own, wear, display, or consume. That was also based on position or rank. It's like the differences in clothing or insignia that indicate the different ranks among people in the military or in the clergy. Actions between parties in rituals similarly serve to distinguish rank and position as well, like who's saluting to whom, who kneels, kisses a ring, or the bowing and touching of the feet of an elder. Ritual regulations serve to both visually and audibly display distinctions in rank or position. It uses an established hierarchy to assign roles in a way that reinforces themselves, simultaneously showing and mediating power dynamics and loyalties within the family. Remember, participants in these rituals often are in your extended family. Early rituals are adapted from ancestral worship practices. As much as rituals govern state affairs, they're built on familiar relations. So, you can understand how Xunzi thought that civic loyalty and duty to the state began with filial piety at home, and why he'd emphasized familial duties and relationships. The Zhou kings used ritual to uphold the entire hierarchical structure on which their social political systems depended. That's what ritual stood for, so its violation represents social instability, which is precisely in the case of the Ji family. Only the Zhou king can have 8 rows of dancers. A head of state could have 6, but as a high minister, Ji was only entitled to 4 rows. His performance was a blatant, open subversion of traditional ritual order that spoke volumes. It amounted to a double usurpation on full display for everyone to see. It'd be like a bishop wearing papal vestments to give a sermon, or a lieutenant assembling 400 men to greet him in the morning. Remember how they used to seal treaties with the blood of animals smeared over their lips? Conditions in the spring and autumn period generated an idiom, 口水为干, literally blood on the mouth is not dry, because it became common that one would break an oath so soon after swearing it, the lips were still wet with sacrificial blood. The Zhou rituals not followed properly can no longer ensure loyalty and stability, and that's a problem. But Xunzi isn't saying that merely going through the motions of the rituals were all people needed to do. Consider these 2 passages from the Analects. In the first passage, notice using rhetorical questions, he thinks that there's much more to ritual practice than mere objects. And looking at the second passage, you can see that merely performing the actions and going through the motions is also not enough. There has to be the right attitude or sentiment that accompanies them. With all their work to highlight distinctions in rank and privilege, ritual ultimately remained in the service of a greater cause. For Xunzi, the dictates of ritual, important as they were, would fundamentally take a backseat to a sincerity of intent or expression of virtue. You can see this when he talks about which changes from the Zhou version of rituals he condones. He considers to what extent they exhibit or train the intentions or sentiments that accompany them. For Xunzi, the focus is always on becoming an ethically judicious Xunzi, a gentleman or noble person. Rituals help facilitate this. They help train in us from the outside in the right way to be, as we look to perform them in the right way, inside and out. This is why returning to rituals is how we fix the world. We use rituals to help people practice how to be virtuous, loyal, dutiful people with the right moral sensibilities. What we don't do is try and coerce or incentivize them from the outside with rewards and punishments. The internal character is where real change happens, so that's where you focus. If we go back to using rituals to make leaders more filial, loyal, and good, they won't want to violate treaties with their cousin or king. Using punishments and consequences won't stop people from wanting to be treacherous on the inside. It misses out on what really matters. So it's not the way to get things done. You know who completely disagreed and thought it was a great way to get things done? Mozi. Mozi's focus was to change and shape behavior first. Why spend time worrying about cultivating moral virtues? Mozi is a practical, pragmatic man. We don't know a lot about his background, but we do know he's a master craftsman, especially of defense machinery. And he had many apprentices, and as a group, they were very organized, well-disciplined, and well-armed. They were non-state actors that would run around and intervene on behalf to help other states defend themselves against conquest. Born just after Xunzi died, as someone who actually lived into the Warring States period, Mozi felt it was far more important to get people to behave well, regardless of their reasons. Stopping wars and crimes was far more pressing. He didn't have the luxury of waiting for the right inner character. He was ready to work with the tools he had. And one of the most effective tools he had were incentive structures and how to motivate people with them. So Mozi advocated for clear systems of rewards and punishments. He knew this would work to alter people's behavior and preferences because in the past, people would change even deeply held attitudes and dispositions quickly and easily when they had the right inducements. As someone consumed with maximizing efficiency and utility, Mozi focused on measurable consequences when it came to determining the best course of action. His KPIs were to grow wealth and production, grow the population, and increase the stability and function of government. That's how all policies, actions, and expenditures should be judged. It helps you understand the 2 important features of his thought, his austerity and his impartiality. When I mention his austerity, I mean Mozi was frugal. He was cheap. He was not one to spend money generously. Who cares if the Ji family had 8 rows of dancers and are inviting Zhou rituals? Everybody should stop having musical performances or dancers, full stop. What a waste of resources. The money required should be put to more practical things. All that time those musicians and dancers took to learn and practice their art could have been spent on farming in the fields or recovering from their toil so that they could go back to farming in the fields. And how about those people who are enjoying these performances? Why are they not working in the field or at the loom or in their government offices? Music doesn't grow the population, improve governing, or increase production or wealth. It's the opposite. Work isn't getting done, and we're wasting and losing money and human resources. It's like hosting the Olympics. So too with funerals. Mozi is against having elaborate, long funerary practices. Don't bury wealth in the ground. It's pointless and wasteful. Don't mourn too long. You'll take too much time off from work. Decorated or dyed cloth? Forget about it. It doesn't do anything to promote the population, governing, or production. Attractive clothes are not necessary for its function. Just like indulgent meals are not necessary for adequate nutrition. Indulge in fun on your day off? Not necessary for you to recover well enough to go back to work. And certainly not helpful if you feel tired or hungover the next day. Fun guy to have at a party he wouldn't allow you to have in the first place, huh? Okay, I guess I should note that he's not against all rituals. The ceremonies in which we make offerings and sacrifices to ghosts and spirits are entirely permissible, even if, he says, ghosts and spirits aren't real. What? Well, for one, the food used isn't wasted. Everyone gets to consume it. But importantly, encouraging people's belief in ghosts and spirits helps scare them or incentivize them into behaving well. Mozi is happy to manipulate people's good behavior using whatever he can. So much for his austerity. What about the impartiality? Well, there's two ways this impartiality comes out. First is in the form of meritocracy. Changes in the Warring States period increased the need for talented people, like to manage the military, agricultural reforms, or fill that growing bureaucracy. And Mozi advocated for hiring based on merit, like how the Sage Kings transferred power. You need talented people, and the best people for the job might not be from the aristocratic pool, much less your own bloodline. So the new power base became bureaucrats rather than the aristocrats. Promoting merit-based talents also means that these people will likely be more loyal than those untrustworthy relatives of yours. Decoupling ministerial positions and wealth from land ownership, social mobility, development of the merchant class and craftsmen, increased immigration and emigration. Merit-based hiring was yielding far better KPIs. Rejecting filial piety and not giving preferential treatment to your own family is the second type of impartiality. Impartial care meant that one should not love one's own family or own people more than that of another's. Rather than prioritize some, one should seek the welfare of all. This, according to Mozi, would yield better results. The only reason there's war and bloodshed is that some people were partial and prioritize themselves and their clan over others. So we adopt impartial care, the world would be better. If you care about consequences, you'll stop promoting filial piety because it encourages partiality. For much of this period, the two most popular schools were the Confucians and the Mohists. And Mengzi is very much in the Confucian school of thought. He's a staunch opponent of Mozi and really didn't care for him. In fact, he even suggests at one point that Mozi was a bastard. Mozi takes interest in incentives to be the motivator, and that's boorish. Confucians take moral virtue to be the center of concern. Mengzi thinks that we all have the capacity for goodness and virtue. He's known for comparing this aspect of our human nature with a plant. When you see something bad about to happen, like a child falling into a well, you'll feel alarm and concern, and you'll have these feelings naturally without anyone having to teach them to you. You're just inclined to respond this way. They're the baby sprouts of virtue within you. Say you're an olive pit. If you plant an olive pit because it's an olive, it grows olive sprouts, and over time, if it's nurtured and watered, the olive sprout will grow into a full-blown olive tree. That's what's happening with our human nature. We all have little human sprouts like compassion or disdain, and over time, with care, they'll grow and develop into full-blown human virtues like benevolence and righteousness. And this is what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to develop these sprouts into virtues and then extend them to others, which is how Mengzi responds to Mozi. Partiality is natural. It's natural to love some people more than others. And in fact, there's a need for this partiality because we learn to be benevolent by practicing benevolence on those near to us, and then we extend it to others. So practice care with your family first, and then you can extend it out to your friends, to your town, and eventually to strangers from afar. They're different training grounds that allow you to practice and learn in order to extend it out further to other people. We'll get into how Xunzi responds to Mengzi as a fellow Confucian next week. There's definitely some internal conflict between them, even though they're both aligned against Mozi. Okay, one last thing to get you ready for next week's close reading of Xunzi. The ideas involved here will form the foundations for what we'll cover later. There's a family of claims that Kongzi, Mozi, Mengzi, and Xunzi all like to argue about. It's the appropriate meaning and correct use of words. This is something that you see across various disciplines and texts throughout history. Defining concepts and terms is a standard part of the discourse, and many times it's the way a more substantive dispute is closed. The people in the 100 schools were no different. They want to nail down different definitions, correct people's use of words, so that everyone can be clear on the agreed meaning of the terms. Xunzi called this the rectification of names, or zhenming, and explained why this would be his first priority if he were hired by the Duke. Notice how he pairs the connection of words to their reference with the function of ritual and music. We'll revisit this more in video 12. Xunzi helpfully offers a few thoughts about why we engage in rectifying names. And it's also an opportunity to reflect on broader questions in HSH about the role and function of words as part of our human condition. Language is something we collectively construct together in virtue of participating in its use. Its existence and function is wholly dependent on our social conventions around it. Consider these passages from chapter 22 on correct naming, in which Xunzi discusses language and words. He talks about names, but he means the words that we use to refer to things. Here's the general idea. Things don't have appropriate names determined by the universe. Words are not predetermined or fixed to specific or particular things. Call whatever thing using any series of noises you want, but do it consistently in agreement with other people and establish a convention or custom. Once that happens, we have social conventions that function prescriptively about the appropriate ways to use these terms. But you might remember back in your seminars when you discussed semantic drift that the meanings of words can change and do deviate from conventions. Fancy institutions such as the OED were clear they were engaged in a descriptive and not prescriptive endeavor. So how do we reconcile this normativity of our language conventions with the shifting meaning of words that have no fixed or preset reference? It's helpful to compare words with other types of social conventions like traffic. Consider countries that have different practices. For example, I grew up in a country where people drive on the right side of the road. Singaporean drivers drive on the left. Who's doing it correctly and who's wrong? Well, from a neutral point of view, no one, either one is fine. But what's important for the sake of order, safety, and harmony is that a group of people all agree to one or the other practice in their jurisdiction. And once we agree and decide on a community norm, the practice becomes prescriptive. Then we can say someone might be doing it right or behaving inappropriately and maybe give them a citation or fine. Change is possible because conventions, linguistic or otherwise, can change. I've already mentioned the changes in ritual conventions that Xunzi considered. All that's required is for people to change their practices, and this is exactly as difficult and as easy as it sounds. Some changes happen quickly, organically, or only within a subpopulation, like sending messages rather than calling on the phone, or the constant churn of new idioms or slang in the vernacular. Other changes happen with difficulty and after deliberate effort. One of my favorite examples is H-Day, where on September 3rd of 1967, the whole of Sweden switched from driving on the left to driving on the right side of the road. There's a huge public information campaign which included one of Sweden's best weapons, pop music. They wrote a song called Keep to the Right, Svensson. Given the immensity of the change, it was a relatively successful switching of conventions. On the other hand, there were still a few hundred accidents and a couple dozen personal injuries. Catchy songs and constant reminders aren't always enough to override ingrained norms to which we've become habituated. changes to our conventions can be risky, which is reflected in what happens with people who inevitably want to go against the set norms and innovate in their use of language as well. When you use words in ways that deviate from their fixed or established conventions, you risk miscommunication, annoying others, or even ostracism. Xunzi notes that going forward, kings will probably keep some old names, but create some new ones based on the reasons for having them in the first place. What types of reasons? Well, obviously, we want to communicate with each other. But what are we communicating, and why do we focus on these particular things? This is a subtle but important feature of our linguistic practices. What kind of words and terms exist can be a telling indication of the sorts of things that are important or relevant for a group of people at a particular time. For example, the 300 words for states of snow that are used by the Sami and indigenous people in Sweden reflects the needs and conditions of their lives as much as the relative dearth of snow terms that are used in Singapore reflect ours. You'll see in video 12 that this also works in reverse. What kinds of words we have or use also influences what and how we think. But for now, let me reframe Xunzi's answer using some existing HSH concepts. Naming conventions should allow us to describe the world in order to make clear the prescriptive standards we desire. This is a larger topic we'll work up to next week, but for now, here's an example of how determining a definition or describing something becomes prescriptive. Consider systems of measurements. We can decide on any type of system and corresponding unit we want. Let's use mass as an example. Until recently, the kilogram was literally defined by this metal object called the Grand K, the world's standard kilogram. The solid cylinder was the kilogram. It described in its own mass and existence what it meant to be a kg. Whether or not something was a proper or true kilo was determined by how other things measured against the standard. There's a soft form of normativity or prescriptive quality that comes with being the standard. It becomes the proper, right, correct way of being the kilogram. Until, that is, 2019. After no further objections from the nations that form the International Bureau of Weights and Measures, this is a community that determines and agrees to the conventions, the new definition of a kilogram officially changed to a monstrous equation. And to think, it started as just a liter of water at its freezing point. You probably didn't notice this change of definition or convention because it was similar enough to how you were using it before. But if you had to start thinking in Fahrenheit instead of Celsius, it's easy to see how difficult a shift in the way we define our conventions can actually be. But this takes me back to where we started in video 9, the changing referent to the term China. Sure, China is a name for a concept, a social construction as much as a kilogram or a pound is. Like the kilogram, China is an entity that's been an idea in flux with no single persistent unifying definition. But to be a social construction or to be an idea is not the same thing as being something that's fake or false or not real. It's a representation of a reality someone is trying to convey. So ends our quick tour of the following states and a few characters in the 100 schools of thought. I want to remind you of what I repeatedly suggested in video 9. On your initial reading of the Xunzi text, all you're aiming to do is to get your eyes over the words and get a broad sense of the main points. Don't worry about the details. First, just recognize places where Xunzi might be agreeing and expanding on Conzi's focus on individual self-cultivation, or defending the role of music, funerals, and other rituals against Mozi's attack, while also using them as a way to combat Mozi's misguided views about what human nature is really like. Later, as you do a closer reading, you can start thinking about how he's doing these things, or the specific reasons that he gives. Along the way, you can look out for his use of metaphors, and then later consider how some of the metaphors and idioms we use might be formed or shaped as part of a larger social linguistic convention. But next week in videos 11 and 12, we'll dig in and have a closer look at Xunzi's text and start connecting it to the human condition, as well as to the individual conditions of our own life. I can't wait to see you then.